At 26 years old, Elara Vance was sentenced to death, but there was no judge, no jury, and no hanging rope. Her crime wasn't murder or theft. It was an empty cradle. Cast out by her wealthy husband and shunned by the very town she grew up in, she was thrown into the teeth of a brutal Wyoming winter with nothing but a thin shawl and a broken heart. They left her for the wolves, believing she was hollow, useless, and weak. But what they didn't know was that out in the high country, where the wind screams like a banshee, there lived a man who had forgotten how to be human. And when a woman with nothing to lose meets a man with nothing to live for, the wilderness doesn't just kill you. Sometimes it teaches you who you really are. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we ride out into the story, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and smash subscribe. And hey, I love hearing from you all. Drop a comment down below and tell me which part of the world you're tuning in from today. I'm glad you pulled up a seat by the fire today because this is a tale of survival, cold justice, and a love that burns hotter than a branding iron. Are you ready? Let's head into the storm. I was 26 years old when my life ended. It didn't happen with a bang or a fever or a fall from a horse. It ended in the parlor of the finest house in Bitter Creek, with the smell of beeswax polish and stale judgment hanging heavy in the air. My executioner wasn't a judge or a sheriff. It was the man who had stood before God 7 years prior and promised to cherish me until death. His name was Caleb Sterling, a man whose land stretched as far as the eye could see, but whose heart was smaller than a grain of sand. You see, in the eyes of that town, I had committed the one sin a woman couldn't come back from. I had given Caleb a clean home, warm meals, and unyielding loyalty, but I hadn't given him the one thing that mattered to his pride, a son. 7 years of silence in the nursery had turned me from a beloved wife into a curse made flesh the day he cast me out. The room was filled with the town's elders and his own mother. Their faces were like stone masks, carved with that cold, self-righteous morality folks use when they want to be cruel but feel holy about it. Caleb stood by the fireplace mantel, his jaw set like granite, staring into the flames. He didn't defend me. He didn't look at me. He just nodded to his mother, sealing my fate with a simple dip of his head. They handed me a small carpet bag. Inside was a shawl, a single loaf of bread, and the clothes on my back. That was the sum total of my life as Mrs. Sterling. It wasn't charity. It was a dismissal. The last words Caleb spoke to me weren't of regret. He leaned in close, his voice low so the neighbors wouldn't hear the venom, and said, "You have a hollow place where life should grow. Now go, and may the Lord have mercy on your cursed body, for this family will not." The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot that killed the woman I used to be. I walked into a Wyoming winter that felt less like weather and more like a personal attack. The wind was a relentless anvil, hammering down on the plains. Every step away from Bitter Creek was a battle against a cold that seeped right through my boots and into my bones. Solitude became a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. The bread didn't last long, and soon my fingers were numb with frostbite. Days blurred into a haze of white and gray. I wasn't Elara Vance anymore. I was a ghost haunting her own funeral. The whispers of the town followed me, telling me I was useless, broken, a warning tale for young brides. Eventually, my legs just gave out. I stumbled through the snow-covered brush, my vision swimming, and collapsed under the skeletal branches of a frozen pine tree. The fight had drained out of me. I closed my eyes, ready for the end my husband had chosen for me. But death didn't come. A shadow did. It fell over me, blocking out the pale winter sun. It wasn't a cloud, and it wasn't a wolf. I forced my eyes open and saw a man standing there, still as the trees around him. A deep primal fear shot through my exhaustion. He was a mountain man, a creature of the high peaks, wrapped in furs, his face a map of the harsh land itself, carved by wind and snow. He watched me like a predator sizing up a wounded deer. I expected him to finish me off, to end my suffering with a blade. Instead, he reached out a hand holding a worn leather waterskin. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. It was just a fact, water. I scrambled for it, my hand shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. I drank with a desperation that was humiliating, the cool liquid feeling like a miracle against my parched throat. When I was done, he took the skin back, clipped it to his belt, and turned his back on me. He started walking away. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. He was leaving me there to die. That brief flare of hope was snuffed out, replaced by an icy dread. But then something snapped inside me. It wasn't hope, it was rage. pure hot anger at the injustice of it all. I refused to die as a footnote in Caleb Sterling's story. "Wait!" I croaked, my voice ragged. He didn't stop. "Wait!" I shouted, pushing myself up onto my elbows. He paused, his back still to me. I had his attention. I knew I couldn't beg. I had been brought low by my own people, and I wouldn't grovel before a stranger. "You walk away from one life," I rasped, finding my strength. "But you are leaving a woman to the wolves. Does the mountain you call home not care for those cast aside?" Silence hung in the frozen air. Slowly he turned. His eyes were unsettling. They didn't hold pity, but they held a deep, ancient sorrow. He walked back and stood over me. "The mountains do not care for the weak," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "They claim them. That is their way." "I am not weak," I countered, though I felt like I was made of glass. "I am surviving." He let out a short, sharp sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You were dying when I found you." He crouched down, his face level with mine. "I will not be your savior. I have no charity for your world, but the spirits of this land do not favor a needless end." He looked me dead in the eye and made me an offer that sounded more like a threat. "So I will make you a promise, hollow woman. Not a bargain, a promise. You will follow me. You will learn to be silent. You will work until your arms ache and your legs tremble. You will forget your husband, your family, and the town that threw you away." He stood up, towering over me again. "If you cry, if you complain, if you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand. That is the only mercy I can offer." It was cruel, it was terrifying, and it was the best chance I had. He wasn't offering a hand to hold, he was offering a cliff to climb. I looked at his hardened face, then at the endless white death waiting for me in the snow. Using every ounce of will I had left, I pushed myself off the ground. My legs shook violently, screaming in protest, but I stood, a woman of 26, rejected and abandoned, standing before a wild stranger. I met his gaze and gave him a single, determined nod. He didn't smile. He just turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if I was following. He knew I would, and that is how my new life began, following a stranger named Elias Thorne into the heart of the wilderness that was meant to be my grave. The journey to Elias Thorne's world was a silent, grueling pilgrimage that nearly broke me before we even arrived. He moved with a fluid, grounded stride, stepping over roots and rocks with an ease that ignored the punishing terrain, while I stumbled behind him, fighting for every breath. My lungs burned like I'd inhaled smoke, and my legs trembled violently, threatening to buckle with every step. But his promise echoed in my mind louder than the howling wind. "If you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand." That fear, the terror of being abandoned again, left to freeze in this white wasteland, was a more potent fuel than any meal I'd ever eaten. It pushed me past the point of exhaustion, narrowing my entire world down to the sight of his broad, fur-clad back and the burning need to take just one more step. After what felt like days, though the sun had only moved a few hours across the sky, he led me through a narrow, jagged gap between two towering rock faces, a passage so well hidden by the landscape that I would have walked past it 1,000 times without seeing it. We emerged into a small, secluded valley, a secret world of stone and shade that seemed cut off from the rest of the territory. A thin trickle of water, miraculously unfrozen, cascaded down a rock wall into a clear, dark pool, the sound of it acting like a balm to my frayed nerves. But this wasn't a homestead. There was no cabin with a smoking chimney, no barn, no fences. His home was a shallow cave carved into the valley wall, its mouth veiled by a curtain of ancient vines and hanging icicles. Inside, it was Spartan, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. There were sleeping furs piled on one side, a blackened fire pit in the center, and a few clay pots and tools that looked elegantly simple but brutally effective. This was not a home in the way I understood the word. It was a den, a place of function and refuge, devoid of comfort or sentiment. It was a perfect reflection of the man himself. In the days that followed, I became a student of his silence. I watched him constantly, my initial fear slowly giving way to a weary, grudging respect. He was a master of this domain, his movements economical, each one imbued with absolute purpose. He could read the subtlest signs in the landscape, a displaced pebble, a bent blade of frozen grass, the distant call of a hawk, and understand their meaning instantly. He taught me, but not with words. His lessons were harsh, practical, and delivered entirely through action. He would simply hand me a task, and I was expected to learn by doing, or suffer the cold consequences. The first real test was fire. He led me to a sheltered spot outside the cave, pointed to a pile of dry kindling and a specific type of flint stone, and handed me a piece of steel. Then, without a single word of instruction, he walked away. I sat there in the biting cold, striking the steel against the stone. I worked for hours. My soft parlor hands quickly became raw and blistered, the skin cracking in the dry air. Frustration mounted with each failed attempt, tears of rage stinging my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Finally, a single spark caught in the tinder, then a wisp of smoke, then a flame. I had earned warmth. I cupped the burning tinder in my trembling hands and brought it to him, a silent offering of my labor. He took it, fed it into the larger fire pit, his expression unchanging. He didn't smile or say good job. He simply gestured for me to sit by the flames. It was a bitter lesson, but as the feeling returned to my frozen limbs, I realized it was life. He hadn't taught me how to make fire. He had forced me to discover it for myself. Another day, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across our valley, he sat working on a trap, meticulously weaving strips of sinew and wood with absolute focus. I sat nearby, tasked with the tedious job of scraping hides, my back screaming in protest. As he finished his work, he paused, his gaze fixing on the dancing flames of the fire we had built. For a fleeting moment, the hard mask of the survivor slipped. A profound loneliness, a deep and aching grief clouded his features. It was as if he were looking through the fire into a past that was far removed from this harsh existence. Slowly, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a single dried wildflower. Its petals were faded and brittle, but still intact. He held it in his calloused palm, his thumb stroking it with a tenderness that seemed utterly alien to the rough man who had dragged me up the mountain. It was a gesture so private, so filled with an unspoken story of love and loss, that I felt as if I had trespassed on sacred ground. In that moment, Elias Thorne was not the stoic mountain man or the terrifying stranger. He was a man mourning a ghost. He put the flower away as quickly as he had taken it out, his expression once again snapping shut like an unreadable shield. But I had seen it. I had seen the crack in the stone. It didn't make him less frightening, but it made him undeniably human. Lying on my rough fur pallet that night, every muscle in my body throbbing with a dull ache, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. I was still a prisoner of my circumstances, bound to this harsh man by a promise of survival. I resented his coldness, his relentless demands. I missed the simple softness of a feather bed and the taste of a warm meal I hadn't had to bleed for. But as I listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing across the fire, a new feeling began to take root in the frozen soil of my heart. It was a hard-won sense of accomplishment. I had survived another day. I had made fire from nothing. Back in Bitter Creek, I was a source of shame, my worth determined solely by my ability to bear children. But here, in this brutal, honest world, my worth was measured only by my will to live. And for the first time in a very long time, staring up at the smoke drifting toward the cave ceiling, I began to believe I was not as worthless as my husband had told me I was. The cold intensified over the following weeks, transforming our hidden valley into a fortress of ice and silence. The game, which had already been scarce, seemed to vanish entirely into the white expanse, hiding deep in burrows or migrating to lower ground. Elias grew leaner, his face more drawn and haggard as he pushed himself further and further each day, hunting for what little the frozen earth would offer. He never complained. Complaining wasn't in his nature, but I saw the toll it was taking. The unspoken tension in our small sanctuary grew with each meager meal, the gnawing hunger becoming a third presence in the cave. The test came not with a roar, but with a stumble. Elias returned one evening just as twilight bled a bruised purple across the sky. He wasn't moving with his usual fluid grace. He was dragging his feet. His left arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, dark and stiff against his coat. A mountain lion, cornered and desperate in the famine of winter, had lashed out. Elias had won the fight, but the victory had cost him dearly. The wound was deep, jagged, and angry. By the next morning, a fever had taken hold with terrifying speed. He lay on his furs, his body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the fire, his breathing shallow and ragged. He tossed and turned, lost to a world of delirium, muttering names I didn't know. His strength, which I had believed to be as indomitable as the granite peaks around us, was gone. For the first time since he found me, I was truly alone. Panic, cold and sharp as a skinning knife, seized me. He was the pillar holding up my world, and he was crumbling. My first instinct was to despair, to curl up in the corner and wait for the end that had been hunting me since I left Bitter Creek. But then I looked at him, at the man who had shown me not kindness, but a brutal, honest path to survival. He had not let me die. I would not let him die. His lessons, delivered in silence and action over the past weeks, rose from my memory like sparks from a flint. I closed my eyes and saw him pointing out a pale, waxy plant with thick leaves near the cave entrance weeks ago. This one draws the poison. His voice echoed in my mind, though he had never actually spoken the words aloud. He had only shown me by crushing a leaf and applying it to a cut on his own hand. I scrambled out of the cave, searching the valley floor with a desperate urgency. The cold bit at my exposed skin, but I barely felt it. I was a hunter now, but my prey was a plant. Finally, I found it, growing in a sheltered crevice of the rock wall, protected from the worst of the frost. I gathered a handful, my fingers numb, and rushed back to the fire. I crushed the leaves between two stones just as I had seen him do, creating a thick, pungent paste that smelled of earth and bitterness. With trembling hands, I unwrapped the crude bandage from his arm. The wound was swollen and red, streaks of infection already beginning to track up his skin. Swallowing my nausea and fear, I gently cleaned it with melted snow from our dwindling supply and applied the green paste. He flinched in his fevered sleep, a low groan escaping his lips, but he did not wake. That was only the first battle. The second was hunger. The dried meat was gone. His bow and snares sat unused in the corner, and I had never successfully trapped anything alone. But I remembered the tracks. I remembered the almost invisible signs he had shown me, the way he would stop and point to a disturbance in the snow, a broken twig, a pattern of droppings. I took his snares and walked out into the biting wind. My first attempts were clumsy. The rope slipped through my fingers. The trigger mechanism failed to hold tension. I wanted to weep with frustration. The image of Caleb's condemning face flashed in my mind. Hollow, useless. No, I whispered to the wind. I will not be weak. I took a deep breath, mimicking the calm, predator-like focus I had so often observed in Elias. I started again, my fingers slowly learning the rhythm, the tension of the rope, the balance of the wood. I made 3 snares. They were not as perfect as his. The knots were a little rough, the placement a little obvious, but they were functional. I took them to the game trails he had shown me and set them, my hands moving with a newfound certainty. The rest of the day was a vigil of fear and hope. I changed the poultice on his arm. I forced sips of water between his cracked lips. I waited. The next morning, as the first rays of sun touched the valley rim, turning the snow to blinding diamonds, I went to check the traps. The first was empty, the wire loop swinging uselessly in the breeze. The second was empty, knocked over by the wind. My heart sank heavy as lead. But the third snare held a small rabbit, frozen stiff but intact. A wave of triumph so powerful it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't luck. I had earned this. I had listened. I had learned. I had provided. I brought the prize back to the cave and prepared the animal with his knife, my actions hesitant but deliberate. By the time the sun was high, the smell of roasting meat filled the small space. Elias stirred. His breathing changed, deepening. He opened his eyes, and they were clear for the first time in 2 days. The fever had broken. He looked at me, confusion clouding his gaze for a second before memory returned. He looked down at his arm, seeing the fresh green paste and the clean bandages. Then his gaze drifted to the small rabbit cooking over the fire. He said nothing. There were no words of thanks, no effusive praise. That wasn't his way. But his silence was different this time. The silence of judgment was gone. The silence of indifference was gone. This was a silence of acknowledgement. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movement slow and pained, wincing as his arm shifted. I took a piece of the cooked meat, blew on it to cool it, and handed it to him. He took it and ate, his eyes never leaving mine. In that shared meal, in that profound quiet, the air between us shifted. The hierarchy of master and burden dissolved. I was no longer the broken woman he had pitied on the mountainside. I had proven my worth, not to him, but to myself. I had kept the fire burning. I had healed the healer. I had fed the hunter. And in doing so, I had earned something far more valuable than his protection. I had earned his respect. The respect I had earned from Elias was a fragile thing, an unspoken truce in our silent world. But the wilderness is never content with peace for long. The true test of our bond didn't come from the cold or the hunger, but from the outside world we had both sought to escape. It happened 3 days after the fever broke. The sun was high and bright, deceivingly warm when they found us. They were trappers, 3 of them, rough men with sun-bleached beards and eyes that held a greedy, restless hunger. They had stumbled into our valley by chance, likely drawn by the thin column of smoke from our fire that we had grown too careless to hide. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their boots crunching loudly on the crusted snow. They saw our secluded camp, the furs drying on the rack, and the small stack of firewood. But more than that, they saw me. They saw a young woman, far from civilization, and then they looked at Elias, who was sitting by the fire, still favoring his injured arm, his face pale and gaunt. A vile, knowing smirk spread across their faces. In their eyes, I wasn't a survivor. I was a prize. And Elias? He was just an obstacle, a wounded old wolf they could kick aside. "Well now, look what we have here," the tallest one said, stepping forward, his thumbs hooked in his belt near his pistols. His voice was slick with false concern, the kind that makes your skin crawl. "Looks like this poor lady needs some civilized company." They advanced slowly, spreading out to flank us like a pack of coyotes cutting a calf from the herd. My blood ran cold. These were not men of honor. They were men of opportunity, and they saw a golden one. Elias rose slowly. It cost him everything he had. He placed his body squarely between me and them, his knife in his good hand, the blade catching the sharp winter light. His stance was a clear warning, but he was weakened, and they knew it. "Easy there, mountain man," the second man grunted, circling to the left. "We just want to help the lady. She don't belong up here with your kind." As the first man lunged forward to draw Elias's attention, I saw the entire confrontation play out in my mind. Elias, slow from the fever and the wound, would be overwhelmed. They would kill him, and the fate they had planned for me would be 1,000 times worse than dying alone in the snow. But I was not the same woman who had been cast out of Bitter Creek. Fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now woven with strands of something else. The resilience of the wilderness, the focus of a survivor, the fierce determination of someone who had clawed her way back to life. While Elias parried the first man's clumsy attack with his knife, the second one closed in on his blind side, a heavy club in his hand. There was no time to think, only to act. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I reached into the fire. I grabbed the burning end of a thick pine branch, ignoring the heat radiating against my hand, and thrust it directly into the second man's face, just as he raised his arm to strike. The embers caught in his ragged beard instantly. He let out a piercing shriek, dropping his weapon to beat frantically at the flames, a stream of curses filling the valley. The distraction was all Elias needed. With a speed that defied his injury, he turned and incapacitated the first man with a swift, brutal efficiency. The third man, seeing his companions fall, one screaming in agony, the other silent on the ground, turned and fled, crashing through the brush and vanishing from our sanctuary like a coward. The sudden, violent silence that descended was deafening. It was broken only by Elias's heavy, raspy breathing and the distant, fading cries of the man who had run. Elias leaned against the valley wall, the knife still in his hand, his chest heaving. The immediate danger was over, but the wall of silence between us had been shattered by the violence. He slid down the rock wall to sit on the ground, the fight having drained his remaining reserves. I stood there, the charred branch still smoking at my feet, trembling not from cold but from adrenaline. After a long moment I found my voice. It was time for the truth. "Did you have a family?" I asked. The question was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed in the stillness with the force of a thrown stone. He stared at a place beyond the valley walls for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. "Yes," he finally said, his voice rough. "A wife, a daughter. They were taken by the fever, the burning, sickness that swept through the settlements years ago. I sat with them until their spirits left." He paused, and the grief I had once glimpsed in his eyes now filled them completely. When they were gone, my own spirit went with them. I could no longer be among my people, among the memories. I became what I am now, a man who walks alone. The simple, devastating story hung in the air. He had lost everything. He looked up at me, and his eyes held not judgment, but a shared understanding of loss. "The man who cast you out?" he asked, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Did he know what it cost you?" Tears I didn't know I had left to cry welled in my eyes. "He blamed me," I whispered. 7 years I prayed. 7 years I tried every remedy, every doctor. But to him I was just broken, a failed investment." I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "His mother told me I was cursed, that God was punishing me. I never saw him grieve with me, only resent me. In the quiet that followed, we were no longer a mountain man and a rejected woman. We were just two people stripped bare by sorrow, our tragedies laid out between us like maps of a foreign land." I saw that his arm was bleeding again. The wound reopened in the struggle. Without a word, I went to our supplies, brought the green paste and a clean rag, and knelt before him. As I gently cleaned and redressed the wound, my touch was not just that of a student repaying a debt. It was the touch of someone who cared. He watched me, his guard completely down for the first time. When I finished, he reached out with his good hand. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as he tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. It was a simple, profound gesture of tenderness. We were no longer bound by a promise of survival. In the crucible of shared danger and shared sorrow, a new bond had been forged. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to turn away. But I didn't. I met him halfway. His kiss was not one of passion or desperate need. It was as gentle as the fall of snow, a soft, reverent touch that spoke of shared sorrows and a future neither of us expected to have. It was a promise of protection, a vow of tenderness, and an acceptance of this strange, beautiful thing we had built together in the heart of the wilderness. In that moment, we were no longer two separate broken souls. We were a family of two, and for the first time since I walked out that door in Bitter Creek, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a sunrise we would get to see together. Spring arrived in the high country not with a whisper, but with a riot of life. The ice that had choked our valley retreated, revealing a carpet of wildflowers that pushed through the thawing earth with stubborn resilience. The silence of winter was replaced by the rush of the waterfall and the song of returning birds. And in that season of rebirth, our small family grew. I found a wounded fox kit near the cave entrance, a scrap of russet fur shivering in the mud. We named her Ember for the fire that had saved us both, and nursing her back to health became my joy. But the past is a patient hunter. One morning, the peace of our valley was shattered by a voice I knew too well. "Elara, we have come to deliver you from this savagery." It was Mrs. Sterling, Caleb's mother. She stood at the narrow entrance to the valley, flanked by half a dozen armed men from Bitter Creek. She hadn't come to save me. She had come to reclaim a piece of property that had embarrassed the family name. Elias stood instantly, his hand hovering near his knife, his body tense as a coiled spring. "Mrs. Sterling?" I said, stepping out from the cave. My voice didn't tremble. "You have no right to be here. Your son cast me out. He left me to die. This is my home now." She looked at me, expecting to see a broken, weeping wretch. Instead, she saw a woman standing tall, wearing furs she had cleaned, beside a man who looked at her with reverence, not ownership. The sight twisted her face into a mask of righteous fury. "You speak with a devil's tongue," she spat. "You are barren, Elara, worthless. You abandoned your duty. Come back now, or be dragged back to answer for your sins." The men raised their rifles. The air grew thick with tension. Elias stepped in front of me, ready to die to protect the life we had built. But before the first shot could be fired, a small, limping shape darted out from the cave. It was Ember, the fox kid, oblivious to the danger, ran to me, mewling softly. Instinctively, I scooped her up, cradling her against my chest. The sight of it, the barren woman nurturing a wild creature with such fierce tenderness, gave the men pause. They lowered their rifles. One of them, an older ranch hand, looked at Mrs. Sterling and said, "Ma'am, that don't look like no captive. That looks like a woman who's found her place." "She is hollow," Mrs. Sterling shrieked. "I am not hollow," I declared, my voice ringing off the canyon walls. "I have learned something in this wilderness that you will never understand. My worth is not measured by what I can produce for a legacy. I have learned to hunt. I have learned to heal. I have learned that family is not defined by blood, but by the love you build." I looked at the men, then back at the woman who had tormented me for years. "I choose this life, real life, not the slow death you dressed up as duty. So go, tell them I am dead. Because the Elara you knew is dead, I am alive." The authority drained from Mrs. Sterling's face. She looked at her men, but they would not move. They saw the truth. With a final curse, she turned and walked away, her footsteps heavy with defeat. They left us to the silence, and for the first time it felt completely ours. That evening, as the fire crackled, Elias reached into his pouch and pulled out the dried wildflower he had carried for so long, the memory of his past grief. He took my hand and pressed the flower into my palm. "It was my anchor to the past," he said softly. "But you gave me a future. Keep it, Rose. Keep it as a reminder that from the deepest grief can come the most beautiful new beginning." I placed it next to the carved fox he had made me. I was 26 when they told me my life was over. I was 27 when I realized it had just begun. I wasn't hollow. I was full of strength, full of love, and finally, truly free. Well, partners, that brings us to the end of Elara and Elias's journey. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the world has to break you down just so you can rebuild yourself stronger than before. If this story touched your heart, please do me a huge favor. Give this video a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and make sure you're subscribed to Frontier Rescue. Stories with that notification bell turned on. We've got a whole playlist of tales from the Wild West waiting for you on the channel. So go check those out next. What did you think of Elara's choice? Would you have stayed in the valley? Let me know in the comments. And if you have any ideas for the next story you want to hear, drop them down there too. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your fire burning and your powder dry. Best wishes to you all.